the ancestors, both past and present, and I acknowledge the first act of injustice in this country, being the taking of Indigenous land without consent and with violence. This country was not just bush in 1788, this country was not settled. And the British dumped their poor, their needy and their unwanted, and now we deny others who are poor, needy and unwanted. This was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I thank my Aboriginal brothers and sisters for sharing your land with me and allowing to walk upon it. In less than 2 years, Australia has experienced a tumultuous period where our political leadership has used politics of fear to foster division within the Australian people, to breed suspicion of Australian Muslims, to further criminalise asylum seekers in the minds of the public, to pass laws which impact upon our civil liberties and human rights and which breach our international obligations. They have used these politics to distract the public from deeply unsustainable and ineffective policies. And as united communities, we say no more. No more. No more. And I say thank you to the Australian public who, when faced with the images of precious children just like ours, washing up on the shores of Turkey, you raised the issue of asylum seekers in the minds of the Australian consciousness. You forced Australia's horrific treatment of asylum seekers onto the stage within the mainstream political arena. However, I dare not ask the question of if we would have been moved to the same extent if it had been young men washing up on the shores instead of children. Perhaps we are not ready as a country to answer that question. However, in time, we will have to. And this is the power. This is the power of when communities are united. None of us alone can save our nation from being resigned to the shameful pages of history, where our children's children will be called upon to explain the sins of inaction towards asylum seekers, towards those who are the most vulnerable. Our apathy. None of us alone can change the future, but united communities can. And there is a lot to change. Malcolm Turnbull was sworn in as our 29th Prime Minister on the 15th of September 2015. And I call upon Mr Turnbull to consider what type of legacy he wishes to leave behind. Because we know the awful truth, that turning back the boats merely means asylum seekers will die in someone else's waters. They will wash up on someone else's shores. Mr Turnbull, can you look into the eyes of asylum seekers fleeing persecution and war and push them back out to sea to die? Shame. Will this be your legacy? With the Syrian crisis entering its 5th year, the government announced in the federal budget that $1 billion in aid cuts for 2015 to 2016 will occur. Funding to the Middle East and North Africa, including Syria, was one of the hardest hit. The amount Australia provided in aid to Syria from the mid-2014 to mid-2015 dropped from 53.7 million to less than 8.8 million. The recommitment of 44 million is still woefully under what Australia can and should be pledging. This is whilst international aid agencies are screaming out that they cannot afford to feed those who have been displaced by this civil war. Mr Turnbull, Syrian civilians are caught between the Assad regime, who use vacuum and barrel bombs against its own people, and violent terrorist organisations. Australia should not be launching a military intervention into Syria. Mr Turnbull, will you continue to allow the military intervention when all it will do is increase the humanitarian crisis hemorrhaging out of Syria? Will you allow our troops to directly support the Assad regime? Will this be your legacy, Mr Turnbull? And all civilians in Syria are suffering. Christians, Muslims, Yazidis, atheists, men, women and children. Everyone is suffering. And Australia should not deviate from the well-established procedures in place for refugee applications and assessments. To do so would to step away from our international refugee obligations and send a message that you personally believe that single Muslim men are by default a security threat. Being single or a man or Muslim does not disqualify you from being persecuted from being tortured, from being killed. War is not selective in death. And we should not be selective in those who are eligible to receive our compassion, certainly not either indirectly or directly on religious grounds. Remember the massacre when 6,000 Muslim men were slaughtered. Mr. Turnbull, will this be your legacy? Mr. Turnbull, do not sanction self-harm and sexual exploitation of those who are vulnerable and turn to our country for safety, who instead of offering them the boundless plains we have to share, we place them instead on Nauru and Manus. Will the fact refugees in Australia's care are swallowing razor blades, drinking detergent, and who are being sexually abused be your legacy? Mr. Turnbull, will you allow the Border Force Act to remain? Laws that make it a criminal offence for whistleblowers to disclose the abuse of asylum seekers. At a time when we are holding a royal commission into institutional responses to child sexual assault, Mr. Turnbull, will the silence of those who have been entrusted in your care be your legacy? And the truth is, the shameful truth is, that in many ways Australia's shameful refugee policy is a bipartisan policy of cruelty. And as a united community, we say that we can do better and we must do better. And we cannot move forward, however, without looking back. In 1945, Australia was a founding member of the UN. It was instrumental in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. My own mother came to Australia as a refugee in 1950, and she spent many years in a camp, the Silver City, in corrugated igloo huts that were cold in winter and hot in summer. My grandfather was an engineer, but upon arriving in Australia, his qualifications were not recognised. He found a job working on the railway, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. My mother is a strong woman, and I hope one day to be a tenth of the woman that she is. Any rhetoric that seeks to paint refugees as criminals ought to be outright rejected. The tapestry of our country has been woven and made stronger by the contributions of refugees. They are our mothers, our fathers, our grandparents. They are humans, sharing the same burning desire to live freely, where their human rights are respected, and to live safely with their families. We have nothing to fear from refugees. Instead of our country building upon the framework that was set up in 1945, we have fallen far below what any democratic country should aspire to. And it's not just a change in political leadership and a change in policies that this country needs. This country needs communities. It needs citizens who love it enough to reimagine the future, to act as the architects, to be prepared to lay the bricks of a civil society one by one, to remake it a just, a fair and a compassionate society, a compassionate country, where each brick represents a promise to make a positive difference, where in the face of division you foster unity, where in the face of humiliation of the most vulnerable you shine the light of compassion, where in the overwhelming shadow of fear you are brave enough to seek to understand, where you strengthen the bonds that bind communities together. Will you lay these bricks with me? Will you lay these bricks with me? Yes. And will this be your legacy? Yes. Thank you.